1976 or so and hasn't been replaced. Some of those wires would fray, some of the insulation start to break, and if they short.
Boeing 747 departs JFK on a bright July evening, headed for Paris and Rome, in one of aviation's most enigmatic mysteries. 230 people are lost as a fireball bursts into the night sky over the Atlantic 16 minutes later. How could a normal flight turn into a disaster so fast? Why did the investigation revolve around something as commonplace as the air conditioner? And why do theories still conflict today? We explore TWA Flight 800, its mysteries, and its catastrophic chain of events in this movie. The flight that wasn't necessary, TWA Flight 800 on July 17, 1996, wasn't intended to be flown by the aircraft that finally took off. The initial plan was to use a newer Boeing 767 for the voyage to Paris, with Rome as the final destination. However, Trans World Airlines resorted to an older Boeing 747-100, tail registration N93119. After that aircraft experienced mechanical issues. This aircraft was getting close to retirement after more than 20 years of service with the company. However, the airline decided to continue rather than cancel, since in the aviation industry, adaptability equals survival. Due to such a choice, 230 passengers and crew members boarded on airplanes that were in better shape. One of the mainstays of the TWA fleet in the 1970s and 1980s, when the airline was a mainstay of transatlantic travel, the aircraft was iconic in its heyday. However, the 747s were beginning to show signs of aging by the middle of the 1990s. Their systems were antiquated, their wiring was old, and their operating expenses were increasing. Globally, airlines were gradually swapping them out for more effective models. This specific aircraft was essentially used as a stopgap when the airline needed to fill a gap in its itinerary. This was not widely known by the travelers arriving at JFK that night. All they saw was a well-known, broad-bodied giant that promised adventure and comfort on the other side of the seas. However, things were a bit more complicated in the cockpit. Captain Ralph Kevorkian, the aircraft's pilot, was a veteran who had served for more than 30 years. Steven Snyder, his co-pilot, has flown for well over 30 years. Richard Campbell, the flight engineer assigned to oversee the aircraft's technical systems, was also on board. Oliver Crick, a student flight engineer who had only flown a few times, was also present, despite the fact that airline operations often entailed training during actual flying conditions. This intricacy meant that Captain Kevorkian and Campbell had an additional duty that evening to make sure Crick was learning while they were putting in a lot of effort at flying. Even prior to takeoff, minor but enduring issues began to appear. The team was abruptly confronted with a problem involving engine number 3. It was discovered that the crew had been compelled to stop down until maintenance personnel replaced the defective cable. It was simply an expected delay that most passengers in the plane found bothersome. Behind the scenes, however, each mechanical glitch progressively wound the spring, not just because timetables needed to be adhered to, but also because of the trust that was placed in an outdated aircraft. There were other delays, of course. The aircraft's time spent in the dreaded sun was further increased by baggage handling equipment that was lying in its path at the gate. The passenger bag mismatch has others worried and horrified. According to aviation regulations, an unaccompanied suitcase must be checked before taking off. For a long time, the ground crew and crew wondered if they were facing a bomb danger. It was later established that the passenger was, in fact, on board. Minutes passed, but the case was over. Overall, Flight 800 experienced a delay of almost an hour. The air conditioners beneath during that time. The cabin floor worked really hard to prevent the passengers from feeling uncomfortable. Due to the heat, these units, which were far from the public eye, were operating constantly and injecting hot air into systems that were never intended to withstand such strain for an extended period of time. It didn't particularly worry anyone on the flight deck, keeping the passengers cool while their weight was their top focus. Nevertheless, those robots were already humming the music of disaster beneath the floor. Thanks to the benefit of hindsight, when the problems were resolved and the 747 was moving near runway to 2R and JFK was covered in dusk, most passengers had started to feel relief following the frustration that had started earlier in the trip. At last, they were in motion. Crews felt that the flight ahead was simple because checklist items were behind them. Irony, however, loomed big as this aircraft was pulled back into service after a lifetime of projected retirement. An inexperienced trainee was in the cockpit, and a string of small mishaps delayed the departure. It seemed like the entire flight had been rebelling from the start. They were all unaware that the delays on the ground might have subtly sown the seeds of catastrophe in the sky. Over the Atlantic, a fireball following an hour of delays, TWA Flight 800 took off from runway 22 or a JFK at 8:19 p.m. with its booming engines. The enormous 747 banked eastward over the Atlantic, climbing steadily into the warm summer twilight. There was a general feeling of relief among those inside after the wait that the long voyage had finally started, and Paris, Rome, and getting together with loved ones were all on the horizon. Nobody could have predicted that the night sky would burst into terror in 16 minutes. The climb's initial ascent went smoothly and without incident. While keeping an eye on multiple other flights in the crowded corridor, Boston Central air traffic controllers gave the plane the all-clear to resume its ascent. Flight 800 showed up on radar screens as completely normal. The controllers saw it as just another blip traveling in the anticipated direction, one of several hundred that crossed that night on the eastern seaboard. However, something invisible was developing deep within the plane's systems during the silent intervals between radio communications. At 8:31 p.m., witnesses saw a quick, dazzling flash. Then quiet fell over Long Island and out to sea. While piloting a Boeing 737 near Eastwind Airlines, Captain David McLean noticed what seemed to be something brighter than the brightest light in the distance. After all the time had passed, he initially believed that the main aircraft's landing light was on. McLean briefly switched his lights in an effort to give a visual cue. As soon as he spotted the plane in his line of sight, it burst into massive fireballs, leaving him absolutely stunned. What started out as a minor oddity turned into a complete disaster. Numerous additional witnesses from the boats and the shoreline also reported what happened. Debris descending from the sky, a ball of flame, and a dazzling streak of light. Some others believed they observed a missile ascending. Others might have reported hearing a huge blast that shook the ground and broke windows. The sequence must have been terrifyingly quick within the cabin, yet it appeared to be an instant burst of fire outside. The first thing that broke off the Sven for 7 snout was that it began to fall. The change in center of gravity caused the surviving fuselage to be aggressively yanked upward for a brief minute before breaking apart and plummeting to the water. Boston Air Traffic Control called Flight 800 via radio, but no one replied. The radar signal that showed the 747's movements was shown to be disintegrating and diminishing just moments earlier. Only one flight, TWA 800, was missing, and controllers were working to determine the status of other flights in the area. Reports of a huge aircraft exploding offshore from Long Island congested emergency frequencies. Almost immediately, attracted by the flaming wreckage still smoldering on the sea, rescue helicopters, Coast Guard cutters, and civilian boats rushed toward the site. However, when they arrived at the floating wreck, there were no survivors, and the terrible reality had set in. The ocean surface was littered with seats, baggage, personal belongings, and twisted metal. Because of the explosion's extreme force, nothing had survived. All 230 individuals on board, including passengers, personnel, off-duty airline workers, families, and school children, were now gone. He left Montoursville for Paris. Pennsylvania participates in the exchange program with France along with 16 other high school students and 5 adult chaperones. Their little community was completely destroyed in a single night. Decades of other TWA workers were also returning from vacation, marking yet another death in the airline's own ranks. Each name represented the harsh conclusion of a person's journey rather than merely a statistic. As word of the explosion spread around the world, families waiting at the airports in Paris and Rome found the silence to be intolerable. TWA Flight 800 quickly rose to prominence as one of the deadliest aviation catastrophes in American history. But there were more sinister questions lurking behind the destruction and heartache. What may lead to the disintegration of a huge airliner 16 minutes after takeoff? Was it a mechanical malfunction, terrorism, or something much darker? However, investigators would soon find themselves fighting not just the wreckage, but also one another, while families awaited answers. The wartime investigators, in addition to being a personal tragedy, the wreckage of TWA Flight 800 turned into a battleground for rival agencies. When it plummeted into the Atlantic, in a matter of hours, the NTSB National Transportation Safety Board, and on the scene was the Federal Bureau of Investigation FBI, In the end, TWA Flight 800 left more questions than answers. A routine journey became a tragedy that still haunts aviation decades later. Theories clash, memories fade, but the mystery remains. How could a simple flight vanish in fire and silence? For 230 souls, the night sky never gave them back. And for the world, the truth still drifts beneath the waves.